Hello, everyone, and welcome to Chapter 7. Today we are talking about literacy in the adult client population. This is coming out of Health Professional as Educator, right? What Tracy often refers to as the Brown Book, but there is a newer version as well that is not brown anymore, sadly. First of all, I want to just state the importance of literacy. So, illiteracy is a huge problem in the United States. Many adults here are either marginally illiterate or functionally illiterate. And this is a problem that's only going to get worse as technology advances, especially when we're talking about health literacy and looking at the materials we use to educate our patients. More and more of this is online or involving more complex technology. And as the population ages and technology gets more advanced, it's only going to continue to be more of a problem. So just keep in mind today that we're talking about literacy in general, and we're going to talk about ways to measure this, but specifically, we're going to apply this towards the patient population and towards health literacy and what us as clinicians, what we can do. So first of all, before we talk about literacy, we need to understand a bunch of terms here. So first of all, what it means to be literate. There's not necessarily one precise definition. In a broad sense, to be literate means being able to read, write, and comprehend written materials, but the book does specifically state that to be literate means to be able to read, write, and comprehend at a minimum of an 8th grade level or higher. And something to note here is that reading and comprehension are two different things, right? So a kid might be able to read at a certain level, I don't know, let's say 4th grade level, right? But they might comprehend a level or two below that. They might comprehend at, say, a 3rd grade level. And typically, as we age, these levels tend to go up. But it gets to the point with readability, right? Your readability tends to always be maybe a level or so above your comprehension. But you do kind of get to this point where you know enough words to be able to kind of figure out new words with context clues. And the words that you don't know, you can tend to look them up and figure out their meaning and kind of add them to your vocabulary. So your comprehension skills can continue to increase as you age and as you read more. And having higher comprehension skills and higher literacy tends to lead to better salaries, more promotions, and these benefits tend to also pass on to your children as well. So basically, the more you read, the more you comprehend, and the more you comprehend, typically the better quality of life you have in general. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have illiterate. So once again, at a basic level, illiterate can mean being unable to read, write, or comprehend written materials at all, but the book also defines it as being able to read, write, and comprehend at less than a 5th grade level, right? So if they can't read, write, or comprehend at least a 5th grade level, then they are illiterate, right? If we're talking about a patient here. Now, a lot of times when we talk about illiteracy in the United States, we are not talking about someone who is completely illiterate. We tend to be talking about people with low literacy or functional illiteracy, which I will get to in a second. So just understand that when someone says illiterate, that can mean a lot of different things, and it might not necessarily mean illiterate as in can't read. So moving on, talking about low literacy, this is also sometimes called marginal illiteracy, and the book defines this as being able to read, write, and comprehend at between a 5th and 8th grade level. So a person with low literacy is able to read and understand things, right? But they tend to struggle with even basic things, right? They might be able to read a Dr. Seuss book, but they would kind of struggle to get through it. They could read, but typically kind of slowly and then tend to kind of struggle with it. So then next we have functional illiteracy. So functional illiteracy is defined as when a person lacks the reading, writing, and comprehension skills to be able to operate in their day-to-day life. So this is someone who, might be able to read and write to some extent, but their comprehension skills have a severe deficit to the point where they can't comprehend instructions that they need to follow for their daily life. So an example of this might be, say, instructions for setting up a new phone line, right? Like you put your SIM card in the phone and you do this and you do that, right? Like that kind of thing, basic instructions. Someone with functional illiteracy might be able to read those instructions, but they don't comprehend the meaning behind them and they can't follow the steps. There's a fundamental lack of comprehension. Another important thing to notate before we go on is that just because someone's illiterate or has low literacy or functional literacy, it doesn't mean they're stupid. And this is something we're going to talk about later. But someone can have an average IQ and be illiterate, right? It honestly has nothing to do with intelligence. And that's just something we need to keep in mind moving forward. So next we're going to talk about health literacy. Health literacy is essentially what it sounds like. It's the ability for someone to read and comprehend health-related materials in order to maintain their own health, essentially. Readability doesn't have to do with the reader or the patient in this case. It has to do with the materials. It's how easy is it to read through these materials. And comprehension is, once again, it's not just can you read something, do you know what it means? Can you truly understand it? And that's what comprehension really is. Moving on. So now we're going to talk about elements that affect readability and comprehension. So we have two sides here. We have the material variables, as in factors of the actual learning materials, and then we have reader variables, factors with your patient that can affect their comprehension. So first of all, talking about materials, we have legibility, so print size and spacing. If you have a printed educational material and it has a tiny font and it's really hard to read, guess what? It's going to affect their comprehension. Same with if the spacing is off and everything's squeezed in too close. Organization and flow of content. Concept level. So if we're talking about things at too high of a level, it's going to be more difficult to comprehend. Length of the text. Sentence structure and level of vocabulary. This once again has to do with complexity. Relevance to the reader. So this is a big one too. I myself, I like to think that I'm a fairly literate person, right? I'm not the smartest in the world, but I can read and comprehend at a decent level. But if you give me, I don't know, say a manual on how to operate an aircraft or something like that, I might go through this and it might just look like technobabble to me. And I might not really understand it because it's not relevant to what I know. It's not within my knowledge base, and it's probably using jargon and technical terms that I am unfamiliar with. So relevance to the reader is another big deal here. A number of polysyllabic words. Once again, how complex are the words that we're using? Now, over on the other side, talking about reader variables, there's some big ones here. Health status, perceived threat of illness, effects of illness/stress, physical and mental energy. Think about it. If you have a patient and they're direly sick and they're in the hospital and they're stressed out and they're getting poked all the time and they can't sleep because people keep waking them up all the time, they are probably not going to have a lot of energy, not a lot of mental focus, and their comprehension is probably going to be a lot lower. You know, if you've ever taken a test on barely any sleep while you're sick, it probably didn't go that well for you. It's that kind of thing. Level of motivation, that's another big one. If your patient is not motivated to learn about their condition, if they're not willing to be educated, then you're going to have a really hard time educating them. And if they're not motivated, they're probably not going to read those printed materials, right? Visual and auditory acuity. If your patient has hearing or vision problems, there can be a breakdown in communication and it can affect their comprehension. Educational attainment, background knowledge, ability to decipher language of message. These are all knowledge related things. Your patient has to have some level of knowledge to be able to comprehend things. Ability to decipher language of the message. That's a big one there. That is kind of like relevance, right? So if you give me something printed in Spanish, I'm not going to understand it because I can't read or speak Spanish. And, I might be literate in English, but if you hand me something in Spanish, it's going to look like I'm illiterate because I can't read it, right? So it has to be in the correct language as well. And that also includes stuff like medical jargon or other technobabble sounding stuff. In general, it's better to keep it simpler. Makes it easier to comprehend. So backing up a little bit, let's just talk once again about the scope of the problem. I know I said at the beginning that illiteracy is a big problem. Well, here's a big fat pie graph that kind of tells you the extent of that. So over here we can see in the orangish red, 52% approximately of the US adult population is literate, meaning that they can read, write, comprehend at least an 8th grade level. 52%. The other 48% struggle quite a bit. You've got 26% that are marginally illiterate, meaning that they read and comprehend at between a 5th and 8th grade level. And you have 22% that are functionally illiterate, meaning they struggle with their day-to-day lives. They don't have the literacy, the competency to succeed in their day-to-day lives. And of course, this can cause a lot of problems in people's lives in general, but especially when we're trying to teach and educate them regarding health conditions, it can create a lot of problems regarding compliance and motivation, which we will talk about later. So let's talk about who these people are, who's at risk for low literacy. So first of all, economically disadvantaged. So if someone is of a lower socioeconomic status, they may not have grown up in as great of a home environment. They may not have the best nutrition. Their schools may not be the best. They may not have parents that are highly educated or parents that are able to help them with their education, right? All these things are factors that could put somebody at risk of having low literacy. Older adults, if you have been out of school for 50 years and you haven't really done a job that requires a lot of reading or writing or anything, and you're not using those skills, they're going to go away to some extent, right? You have a higher risk of having low literacy. Immigrants, racial minorities, once again, this kind of goes back to the language thing, right? Somebody in their native language, might be totally fluent, literate, can read, write, everything, but you hand them something in English, and if their English skills are not as good, they're not really illiterate, but it's going to make them look like they're illiterate, right? So that's something we have to keep in mind too with our patients, right? Sometimes we need interpreters if there's a language barrier. And if you're trying to teach somebody about their inhaler and they don't speak English, it's probably not going to go over very well. And so they're not really low literacy, it's just that their English literacy is low. High school dropouts kind of goes with the whole, if they have problems with the educational system, they're not very well educated, they're at a higher risk. Unemployed, prisoners, once again, that's kind of a low socioeconomic status kind of thing. Inner city and rural residents, this kind of goes back to the schools. So public education in the United States, the way it is funded, a lot of it is through local property taxes. And so if you live in an impoverished area where property values are low, there's less tax money going into the school system, and the school's going to get a lot less funding. And the schools probably already don't get as much support, right? The parents that live in those areas can't support their kids as well. And at the end of the day, it's kind of this domino effect where in general, these kids are probably not going to get as good of an education because there's not as many resources, and that's going to put them at risk of lower literacy, especially in a place like here in Nevada where our public education is already so bad. I mean, can you imagine going to an inner city school? It's got to be terrible. And then finally, we have chronic mental physical illnesses. Once again, this kind of goes back to what I was talking about before. If you have a chronic condition, if you're sick all the time and you're tired and you're worn out, it's going to affect your comprehension, it's going to affect your literacy. So, now let's talk about common myths, stereotypes, and assumptions about illiteracy. Illiteracy is highly stigmatized. People that are illiterate are afraid that people think they are stupid. Once again, I mentioned this earlier. Somebody can have an average IQ and be illiterate. Being illiterate does not mean somebody is stupid. People can be very articulate and very smart, but not know how to read. It happens. Embarrassment leads to underreporting of illiteracy. Once again, people are afraid they're going to think they're stupid. And so this type of thing tends to get underreported. People find ways to hide and conceal their illiteracy. A lot of these people are very smart. They've learned to adapt to their low literacy. They've learned to hide it and figure things out without being able to read and understand directions very well. And so they actually have this kind of amazing way of being able to cope with this and survive the way they do. And some people are very, very good at hiding this. So now let's talk about some of these myths. Once again, myth number one, they're intellectually slow learners. Already said that, right? Has nothing to do with it. Myth number two, they can be recognized by appearance. Right? You might think, oh, well, they must be poor. They must dress all raggedy and stuff. No. That's not true. There have been some people that are very rich, very powerful, that have not been able to read. There's people out there walking around in fancy clothes and suits and ties, and they're marginally illiterate, right? They've got low literacy. Those people do exist. You can't recognize them by appearance. These people come from all walks of life. Myth number three, number of years of schooling correlates with literacy. This is not true at all. People already tend to kind of read and comprehend a couple of grade levels below what grade level they actually completed. These things don't really correlate. In fact, right, your average adult has completed high school, right? Of course there's plenty of high school dropouts, but most adults have their high school diploma, or at least a GED. However, the average reading level for an adult is 8th grade level. And that's, by the way, once again, is the same number to be considered literate, 8th grade or above. And the average reading level is about 8th grade. So number of years of schooling and, grade that is achieved really does not correlate with literacy. Another myth, most are foreign-born, poor, racial, or ethnic minorities. Once again, those things can be risk factors, but it doesn't mean that that's always the case. And finally, myth will freely admit they cannot read or write. Once again, these people are stigmatized. They're afraid people are going to think they're stupid. Now, not all of them are like that, right? Not all of them hide it. Some people are even defiant about it. Defiant about the fact that they can barely read or write. But at the end of the day, it's a mix. This idea that everybody will freely admit that they're illiterate is really not true. Some will, a lot won't. It's really a mixed bag. So now we're going to talk about another important thing here, the impact of illiteracy on motivation and compliance. So poor literacy skills can also impact communication and problem-solving skills. If somebody cannot follow directions very well, they might have a hard time actually getting through material. It's going to affect their problem-solving skills. And this, once again, is sort of a domino effect. These patients can also be reluctant to ask questions, You might teach these patients about something, right? Maybe an incentive spirometer, and ask them if they have any questions. They might say no, not because they actually don't have any questions, but they might say no because they're afraid that you're going to think they're stupid, or they might not even know what questions to ask in the first place. These patients, once again, also have difficulty with analyzing instructions. If they can barely read the instructions and they can't comprehend them, then at the end of the day, whatever device or exercise they've been taught, they're not going to be able to use because they don't understand the instructions. In a lot of ways, these patients might end up being non-compliant, not necessarily because they don't want to comply. It's not that they're being defiant, it's just that they are unable to understand. Studies have shown that illiteracy impacts the way a person organizes, interprets, analyzes, and summarizes information. These people, sometimes they tend to think in simpler terms, and they may not understand some of these kind of like higher level concepts and whatnot. This once again goes back to factors affecting comprehension of materials. If it's at too high of a level or too complex, people with low literacy might have a hard time understanding it. All these things are going to cause patients to feel frustrated, feel like they're not being heard, and feel like they're not getting their problems solved because they don't understand what you're trying to tell them and they don't really know how to voice that. And so this creates huge problems with motivation and compliance. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the readability of printed educational materials. So printed educational materials can be anything. Pamphlets you find in the ER about various conditions. These can be from pharmaceutical companies. They can be booklets. Pretty much any educational material that you can use to educate a patient with, right? There's tons of them out there. We've already kind of learned about them, but something important to note is that most printed educational materials are written at an average grade level of 10th to 12th grade. Remember, the average adult reads at the 8th grade level. So 10 to 12th grade is quite a bit above that, and your average adult is probably going to have a hard time understanding it. And here's another thing too. Even sophisticated readers prefer simplified printed educational materials when they're ill. Think about it. If you're feeling really bad, if you're not at your best, are you really going to want to read all this complex material? Probably not. You're probably going to have a hard time with that, even if you regularly enjoy reading more complex, higher level materials. At the end of the day, simpler is better, which is something we're going to talk a lot about in a few slides. So we're going to talk about formulas to measure the readability of printed educational materials. So more than 40 formulas exist, but we have to note that we need to use these formulas with caution. There must be a match between the reader and the material, right? But even then, this match doesn't guarantee the reader is going to comprehend it. And so there's a ton of different methods we use, and these are just a few of them. The first one, the SPATCH grade level score. This is actually meant for scoring children's materials at below the 4th grade level, so it's not used for adult materials, but the other models are used for adult materials, and pretty much all of them rely on length of sentences and complexity of words with multiple syllables, using large complex words. Those are the kind of things that these formulas tend to grade printed educational materials on. They all do it in slightly different ways, and the book has a lot more details on them, but these are all used to measure the readability of these materials. So then we have some tests to measure the comprehension of printed educational materials. So first we have the close procedure. So this is a test you can give a reader to see if they comprehend this material, and what you do is you take the material and you remove every fifth word. And basically the reader has to fill in the blanks, essentially, and fill in those words, and every word they get correct is a point for them. And so that's one test they can use. But if you have a client who has lower literacy, if they can't read very well, there is something called the listening test. And basically, with the listening test, a material is read out to the client listens to it, and then the client is given some questions based off of that material, and they have to answer the questions. So it doesn't involve any reading on the part of the client, it's a listening test, as it says. So that's one alternative method. So now we're going to talk about simplifying the readability of printed educational materials. In general, something right here, less is more, simpler is better. First of all, decide what the client should know or do. What is the purpose of this material? If I'm giving my client a printed educational material on asthma, what is the point of it? Am I trying to teach them to avoid triggers? Am I trying to teach them about peak flow meters? What are we doing, right? You have to know what the purpose is. Choose relevant information that teaches survival skills, no fluff, no excess nonsense, right? Only teach the patient what they need to know. Don't overcomplicate it with extra information, because especially when you have these lower literacy clients, they're not going to understand all these things. Once again, they're struggling with it, and if you're just shoving more and more information on top of it, they're not going to get it, and they're going to struggle immensely. Supplement written materials with pictures and videos, especially if they have low literacy. If your client has a hard time reading, pictures and videos and whatnot might be a great alternative that can be used. Models, those kind of things, so long as they're not too complex, can be great supplements along with the written materials to help get the idea across. Also remember, like, people have different learning styles, and not everybody is going to learn great just by reading some pamphlet or something. Some people need a demonstration, they need a video, they need a model or something they can look at or play with in order to understand things. Also, organize material into chunks that follow a logical sequence. If your material is all over the place and all scrambled around, it's going to be hard for anyone to follow, let alone somebody with low literacy who's struggling to read the stuff in the first place. And always aim for the 5th grade level. It's the lowest common denominator. Remember, the average reading level is at the 8th grade, but when somebody's sick, when somebody has a condition, they probably want to read below that. And some people are not going to read at a 5th grade level. Some people might struggle to even do that, right? They might barely be at a 5th grade level. And so that's what we aim for, to essentially simplify the material so it can apply and be taught to as many people as possible. The 5th grade level is also the level where you tend to see like the national newspapers, like big newspapers written at. It's the 5th grade level because, once again, it's the lowest common denominator. The largest amount of people are able to understand that material. So always aim for that. You don't want to make material too complex. The goal is not to get your patient to pass an A&P exam or something. Your goal is typically to educate them about their condition and how to take care of themselves and that kind of thing, right? And if you can do that in a simpler way, that's better. We don't have to use more complex methods than it warrants, because it's only going to create problems. So, teaching strategies for clients with low literacy. So, first of all, you have to establish a trusting relationship with the client. Once again, these people are highly stigmatized, and they always, not always, but a lot of them have that kind of feeling of like people are going to think they're stupid. You have to empathize with them. You have to show them that they can trust you and that you're there to help them through their condition, help them through their hospital stay or whatever it is, and really be there with them, because if you don't build trust with them and they don't trust you, they're not going to listen to you. Point number 2 here goes back to what we were just talking about. Use the smallest amount of information possible to accomplish objectives. Keep it simple so people can understand it. Make points as vivid and explicit as possible. Once again, this is just clarity. Make sure everything is clear and understandable. Teach one step at a time. This one's self-explanatory. We don't want to be going out of order. We don't want to be trying to teach multiple things at once. It's really best when someone has low literacy that we take things slow and we break material down piece by piece. Use multiple teaching methods requiring fewer literacy skills. Once again, if your patient has a hard time reading, try to use something verbal. Try to use videos, pictures, those kind of things. Try to find other methods that don't require reading. Whatever it is your client is struggling with, try to use a method that avoids that. Let patients restate information and demonstrate procedures. So this is kind of the teach back method, right? Because if I teach something to somebody, how are they going to demonstrate understanding to me, right? If I just say, do you understand? And they can just say yes, that doesn't really tell me that they actually know anything. And especially with low literacy, once again, when you ask them, do you have any questions? They might just kind of go, no. Because at the end of the day, they might be afraid to ask questions. So getting them to restate information in their own words and getting them to actually demonstrate inhalers and demonstrate the IS and demonstrate whatever procedure they're being taught, this is the only definitive way for you as a clinician to actually know if they've actually understood the material. And motivate them as much as possible. Patient motivation is huge. If your patient is not motivated, if they think it's pointless or they think it's not going to help them or they just don't want to do it, then at the end of the day, they are not going to be receptive to your teaching. Build in coordination of procedures. That's another big one. And use repetition to reinforce information. Most people, if you read a huge paragraph of information, you're not going to retain all of it on the first pass. You're probably going to have to go at it a few times. Repetition is key in order to build skills and build knowledge. So, now we're going to talk about tests to measure the reading skills of clients. So there's a whole bunch of tests in here, and a lot of them are kind of similar. So the wide range achievement test, REALM, the test of functional health literacy in adults, and LAD, literacy assessment for diabetes, those all essentially rely on a list of words and having the client say those words and pronounce them. That's pretty much how those tests work. They use different lists of words and different amounts, and for example, LAD is specifically related to diabetes care and management, so it's for patients with diabetes, but those tests in general work in a similar manner to basically figure out approximately what grade level is my client at regarding their reading. And that can give you a good starting place potentially, right? It's really important to evaluate these things so I know if I'm going to give my client some kind of reading material or some kind of demonstration, I have to know at what level I need to be at for them to understand it. Then we have a couple here, NVS and E-HEALS. These are ones mentioned in the newer edition of the book. Newest vital sign is kind of a weird test where they use a nutrition label from ice cream and they give the patient questions related to that to see if they can answer it. And allegedly, it actually works fairly well. Now, of course, this isn't going to give you an exact grade level of where they are, but newest vital sign is an interesting technique to give you kind of a general gauge of what a patient's literacy level is. And eHealth literacy scale, or eHeals, is a 8-item self-reported measurement of eHealth literacy, right? So it's basically a self-reported tool that a client uses to gauge basically their own skills at using technology to understand health information. So this one's definitely something that's becoming more and more relevant in the modern world where everything's online on a smartphone or a computer or whatever. And then down here we have SAM, Instrument for Suitability Assessment of Materials. This is, just as it sounds, essentially a tool used to find out exactly how suitable a certain material is for clients. So then finally, here I just have my reference, and that is my presentation. I hope you learned something. Thank you.